Welcome to this landscape watercolour tutorial using just 2 colours. Let's get started. So the first thing I've done is I've actually wet the sky area and I'm using my size 6 brush and just using watercolour on its own, and I'm just painting these clouds and the sky wet in wet. It's quite a pale blue sky. I'm just making sure the sky is paler towards the horizon and the clouds are slightly smaller, just to give that little bit of perspective, gives it a little bit of depth as well. So now I'm actually getting to mix the Quinacridone gold with the Ultramarine, and the Quinacridone gold is a really strong colour, as you saw there, so I have to be sort of careful how much I use, but I've got sort of it on its own and then mixed with the blue as well. And I'm painting this now wet on dry with the size 6 brush, painting that distant field you can see there. And I've just dropped a little bit of the Quinacridone gold in. So now I'm painting the foreground. I've swapped to my size 10 brush and I am using the Quinacridone gold with a touch of the Ultramarine. So it's a lot more sort of warmer, sort of yellowy colours. So I'm just sort of painting that in the foreground. What I'm doing now is I've actually made some creamier Quinacridone gold and painting that damp into damp. I'm just putting in now some grasses in the foreground, wet in wet, using the size 6 brush, Quinacridone gold mixed with the Ultramarine. You can sort of just really vary the colours here. It's just slightly greenier, and just dropping that little pathway in wet, adding a touch more Ultramarine now, making the colour actually a little bit creamier. So Ultramarine, Quinacridone gold, I'm trying to make this colour a bit darker, less wetter, so I can paint damp into damp. So I'm just putting these foreground grasses here a little bit more damp into damp. So this colour's quite dark. So I'm just really focusing on that sort of greeny, darker area in the foreground. Using now the size 2 brush, just painting these little marks in here, damp into wet again, just really giving a little bit of detail to those grasses. Take your time and you can just vary the colours, and you're just making these little marks. And if you look at the reference photograph, you can see these little textural marks sort of in the field. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use my twig and I'm just going to scratch the paper just to give a bit more texture and detail to these foreground grasses, and leading your eye through into the sort of middle distance with that sort of pathway. Now I'm mixing up Ultramarine and I've got a tiny touch of the Quinacridone gold in there because I want to paint cooler sort of colours in the distance. I'm painting the distant trees. So you want this colour to have more blue, touch of Quinacridone, but also lots of water. You don't want this too dark because it will come forward and it will make the painting look flat. So we use these artistic tools that we have in our watercolour bag to actually make things look further away. So one of them is tone, the other one is a cool colour, and the other one is size as well. So I'm going to make these smaller and I'm using the size 2 brush. Another way to make things look more in the distance is to give them less texture as well. So that's why in the foreground I've done lots more textures to bring that forward. So it's once you start sort of using all these tools, you can really, you know, sort of design your painting to create depth. So what I'm doing now is I'm just using that size 2 brush and I'm just pulling a little bit of those darker trees to the right hand side. I'm just putting a tiny bit of dark just at the base of those trees, just mostly with the Ultramarine, and slightly thicker paint so it doesn't run as much. So as you can see here, I'm just putting a little bit more damp paint into the base of those trees, and also to give a bit of variety to them as well, because obviously there's lots of clusters of trees there. So I'm mixing up a little bit more of the Ultramarine with a touch of the Quinacridone gold, and I'm going to start painting these sort of middle distant fields. I really love painting distant fields. So you sort of paint a line to begin with, sort of paint that wet on dry. I'm using the size 2 brush because I want to be really careful I don't make this too big, and I'm just now painting the little sort of trees there, little bushes, just so you can be, you know, you don't have to do it exactly like the photograph. You can use that to inspire yourself, but I'm just sort of, you know, doing little clumps and little bits of trees, and it's so effective. It just works. Keep them nice and small, and I'm just putting now this diagonal field going from the tree to the right hand side of the painting, and I'm still using that size 2 brush, which I absolutely love. It almost replaces a rigger for me, or a liner brush. I just really like it because it holds lots of paint, but it's got such a lovely, lovely point. So I really recommend these black velvet brushes. I'm not being paid to say that. I really, really do think they're great. I'm just painting this now, wet on dry. As you can notice here, they're slightly bigger. I'm just bringing these bushes now just to the right hand side of the painting, and already now you've got some fields happening and it's starting to develop. So I'm just using the Ultramarine with the Quinacridone Gold, and the main thing is the size is bigger. That's the main thing. It's the important thing here, just to create some depth in this painting. So I'm just painting this in using that size 2 brush and just softening over that large tree, so it'll allow me, and when I sponge on there later, I don't have any hard edges. So I'm just using the size 6 brush now with a little bit more Quinacridone Gold than Ultramarine, so it's a slightly sort of more warmer colour, and I'm just painting this now, this sort of almost foreground hedgerow, and just dropping in a little bit of slightly darker green just at the top there to give a little bit of texture. So I've really pulled this forward a bit more just to create some more depth in the painting, and I'm just adding a little bit of the ultramarine now, and I'm just going to add that a touch to that there just to give a little bit more dark just at the bottom. And now wet on dry grasses in this middle distant field with the size 2 brush. Now I'm painting some foreground grasses now, and I'm using lots of the Quinacridone Gold, so I'm worked that side of the little puddle on my palette because it's them more sort of golden, aren't they, in the foreground. So I'm painting these wet on dry. So I'm just painting the literally pure Quinacridone Gold, tiny touch of ultramarine just to put darker grasses just in the foreground, but slightly warmer in colour, just sort of giving it a little bit more texture to bring these foreground grasses towards you to make it look more 3D. I'm just using, the touch of the ultramarine with the Quinacridone Gold, using the size 2 brush and just sort of blending, putting it darker at the bottom and then just softening it at the top as well. So now I'm mixing up some very, very creamy colour now because I'm going to be doing some sponging. So I started off with the Quinacridone Gold, add the ultramarine. I'm really trying to make a creamy, thick puddle. You need to make loads of paint. I put my sponge underneath the tap and I wrung all the water out so it's damp, and now I'm really gently tapping this paper, really gently, and now I've just mixed some darker wash up and I'm just painting that now, or sponging that damp into damp. And now that's a really creamy dark colour and it's mostly ultramarine, and I'm going to use the sponge and again gently tap this dark just to kind of create that texture and the dark tonal values of that large tree, but also you've got some of the lighter tones in there as well. I've kind of used a bit of artistic license, and I'm using the twig now to draw out some branches. Again, it's not really in the photograph, but I like to do things like this, create more texture and detail. The twig was a little bit thick actually, so I'm using the corner of the card here just to paint with. I'm actually just using the paint to draw with while it's wet, and it's really effective. And now I'm just going to paint in now some very, very dark green wash right at the bottom of the tree with the ultramarine, with a tiny touch of the Quinacridone Gold, with hardly any water. This tree is still damp, by the way, so that sort of is helping me, but I want to really create that really dark shadows at the bottom of the tree. This is the focal point, so you can afford to put your darkest darks here. Don't be afraid to. So I'm just very gently now just putting a touch more texture on this tree just to finish off painting it. So I'm just using a little bit of the Quinacridone Gold, very watered down, just to kind of glaze that over that field that is dry. Now the paint where I've just put that dark shadow under the tree is still damp, and it's time I can just pull out some lighter areas. So I'm just using this size 2 brush now to paint some smaller branches and twigs, wet on dry. I'm using this same dark now, size 2 brush, wet on dry, just to put a few more darks and details here and there just to kind of finish off this painting. Remember, less is more. So I'm going to be just putting in a little bit of detail here with a sort of a dark wash, and then again going back in with my card, scratching out, creating some textures. I lifted out some of the bushes here in order to lead the eye into the painting. So I'm just sort of finishing off some detail on the bushes here and just putting marks here and there just to finish off using the colours in my palette. You know, I do love to have a little spatter, so I'm just finishing off here with a spatter, mixing the Quinacridone gold with the ultramarine. It also gives some lovely texture in the foreground to create that depth. So I really hope you've enjoyed this tutorial with the voiceover. If you have any comments or questions, please put them in the comments section below. And if you'd like to support the content that I create here on YouTube, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below, but you will get access to weekly exclusive tutorials, downloadable outline sketches you can cancel anytime. Thank you so much for watching this tutorial. Happy painting. Bye for now.